Welcome to the Blue Economy CRC's final webinar for 2023. I'm Professor Chris Carter, Program Leader for Seafood and Marine Products at the Blue Economy CRC, and I'm also Professor of Aquaculture and Nutrition at the University of Tasmania. I would first of all like to, on behalf of the Blue Economy CRC, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are hosting this webinar today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I'd also like to reflect on the deep knowledge of First Nations peoples around the world in understanding seafood. So the Blue Economy CRC was established under a 10-year program by the Australian government through their CRC program, and it was established in July 2019. So we're well into the Blue Economy CRC now. We have 44 participants from Australia and around the world. You can see all our participants on the slide. And the Blue Economy is set up to perform world-class collaborative industry-focused research and training that underpins the growth of the Blue Economy through increased offshore sustainable aquaculture and renewable energy production. So today, as part of that, we're going to have a seminar on thinking about the future of food. It's obviously an extremely topical project, and I'm really grateful, and I think it's marvelous to be able to have this group of world-renowned, esteemed researchers to present a kind of highly engaged, active, personal view around food. To just give you some seeds of thought for that. So each presentation is a kind of speed presentation. And it's set up to be dynamic, thought-provoking, and we hope this will inform our understanding about food and seafood production. At the end of this, there'll be a Q&A session. Please feel free to think about your questions throughout the seminar and type those into the facility. So you can address your questions in the Q&A box on your screens. And there's also an upvote option too. So you can vote for other questions that you like and raise those, and those will be the questions that we'll aim to answer at the end of the 7 or 8 presentations. So as you can see there, we've got a really exciting range of presentations given by our esteemed speakers. So just briefly to introduce those, we have Dr. Andrew Fletcher from the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, the Riddet Institute in New Zealand. Professor Julia Blanchard, IMAS UTAS, who's going to talk about fish supply under climate change. Dr. Anna Farmery from the University of Wollongong, identifying management actions, food-based approach to fisheries and aquaculture. Dr. Rich Cottrell, also from IMAS UTAS, talking about sustainably feeding our blue food. And that will be followed by Professor Duncan Cameron, University of Manchester, who's going to have a look at some terrestrial systems just to provide a counterpoint. And then coming into a talk by Professor John Bowman, Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture at UTAS, talking about future prospects of food-related research and development in Tasmania, so to give us a local flavour. And then we're very pleased to welcome Julie Petty from Seafood Industry Australia, and talking about seafood in the age of advocacy. And then at the end, Dr. Beth Fulton of CSIRO is going to talk about coping with complex seafood futures, one bite at a time. So that's our excellent menu, and we can now move to the first presentation. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Dr. Andrew Fletcher, who will just be loading his slides up, and move into the actual webinar.
Right, thanks, Chris. Kia ora tātou. Hello, everyone. So, look, I get to go first because I'm talking about the really big picture, which is how do we understand the sort of future nutrient needs? And I'm going to talk largely at a global scale. So I'm part of the Sustainable Nutrition Initiative, which was formed in 2019 by these 3 gentlemen, of which I have the pleasure to be one. And it was formed to try and bring evidence into the conversation that was emerging, growing around the future of the global food system. We've since grown from these 3 gentlemen to a much more diverse team, and our team is growing quite rapidly, and a good degree of diversity coming into it. And our overall mission is how do we bring How do we make scientific evidence accessible to improve global nutrition? How do we help people to understand the food system better and in order to make more informed decisions around its future? Because it's one of the most critical systems for all human existence. We've also managed to put together this highly esteemed advisory group to help us on our journey, and we really welcome the input that they bring into guiding our work. Okay, so I talked about the food system. This is a map that was drawn by an outfit called ShiftN that tries to capture all of the different elements that exist within the global food system. And you can see it's highly complex. There's a whole lot of material with it, a whole lot of things within it. It involves politics, the environment, all sorts of things. Just about every aspect of human life is touched by the food system. And of course, obviously, every human being on the planet is touched by it. But a lot of the time, we just tend to think about this bit through the middle, which is sort of the food supply chain, how we get from our farms and oceans through to providing nutrition for people. And that's really a really important place to start, because we need to understand at least that those flows are credible and that what is done, what is coming from those farms and oceans actually has the potential to provide the nutrition that every human being on the planet needs. But so in order to understand this, one of the best things, it's incredibly complex. It's beyond any of our understanding to understand all these different moving parts independently. And we need to create tools for ourselves to help do that. So part of our approach has been to build models. Now, when we think about the food system, one of the things we need to anchor ourselves with is a definition about what a sustainable food system actually is. I think there's a lot of modern conversations have almost equated the word sustainable with environment, but sustainability is much broader than that. And in a food system context, there's this definition from the FAO, which I think is really powerful. So sustainable food systems, they're food systems that ensure food security and nutrition for all, and they do that in a way that they can keep on doing it into the future. And really the most important part about this is that it starts with providing nutrition and food security to people, and then it builds out from that. And so that's the way we focus with our work, is the starting point when we think about the food system is its first job is to provide nutrition. And if it fails to do that, then it doesn't really matter what its environmental credentials are, it has failed, it is not sustainable. So with that as a definition, we then can move forward to say, what are some of the questions we might try and ask around the future of the food system? And we look at this at 3 different scales. At an individual level, we might ask the question, well, what food should we or should I eat in order to meet all my nutrient requirements and to perhaps minimize my impact on the rest of the planet? So what are the decisions I should make? And that scale is from in many ways, for those of us in wealthy Western countries, we've got a lot of decision scope we can make in terms of the foods we choose to eat without actually impacting on the choices that are available to others. So we can model that using diet optimization type tools. At the other end of the scale, which is where most of my focus will be today, we can ask the big question, what food does the world need? As we look into the future, we look at the population we will have and their nutrient requirements. What is the food we need to be able to extract from our farms and oceans in order to have some chance of providing everyone with adequate nutrition? And so, and that question, that's also a relatively tractable question from a modeling perspective, because there are no flows. There's no people say there's no planet B. Well, there's nowhere we can import or export food from beyond the borders of the globe. So we've got nice boundaries there. And then we've got this really tricky one in the middle, which is sort of a national or a regional conversation around what food does our country need, or what do we need to produce in order to sort of do our share in the world, contribute economically, but also to nourish our own people. And how do we get that? And that's really complex because of the degrees of freedom that food trade gives us. So that's the way we tend to think about these scales. And I'm going to talk for the rest of this talk around the big end of town, which is the global question, as a context for the speakers that are going to follow. So we have created a tool that's referred to as the Delta model, and it's referred to as the Delta model because it's all about being able to predict changes, to look at changes or deltas between different scenarios. And what it does is it lets users create a food production scenario by specifying how much of the major classes of food are produced at a point in time in the future, and then compares that with the nutrient needs of the projected population at that point in time. So we can see if we're actually going to at least have some chance of nourishing them. So what it does is the user can specify a total amount of production of food commodities, and there are 9 groups of plant commodities and 6 groups of animal-based foods, and we then look at historic patterns around the way those commodities have been used to use that as a basis for projecting how they might be used in the future. So there are some things which have, there are some food crops that often go into non-food uses. That's not going to suddenly disappear. That's still going to be present in the future. There are a number that get used as animal feed, and how much drain does the animal system pull on the rest of the system in order to actually nourish those animals to produce other food products. So we use that information from the FAO. We take that, we couple it with food composition data from the USDA to then work out the nutrients that are available. And then in the case of protein and essential amino acids, we then adjust that to reflect the bioavailability of those nutrients, to then give us a supply that's available for consumption, which we then compare with our demographics and the nutrient requirements. And we tend to use European requirements as a base data set for working out what that is, so that we can see if the scenario the user's created is going to be credible. And we've got a few scientific publications. I'm not going to dwell on those, but our primary purpose in building it is not so much to have publications and to tell people what the answer is, but to create an environment where people can play and explore for themselves, because that's really where the most powerful learning is. So some of the things we've taken out of building the Delta models, when we start to look at the sources of nutrients, where they come from, there are 29 nutrients we model within Delta. And we look at, and this is just shows where they come from in terms of major high-level food groups. You can see the strong power that the cereal crops, the staples, have as providing the baseline of our diet. But you can also see in some areas the very strong impact that animal source foods have as essential sources of particular nutrients. So other insights we've got from it, I say it's also designed so that you can project forward. So it's not just about where we are now, but we wanted to be able to project forward and say, how do we meet the needs of the future? And we've got a population that's going to shift, right? So this is the demographics for the world, 2020 and 2050, and we can overlay and we can see the difference that's coming. We can see that we're going to have a larger and older population, which is going to have slightly different nutrient needs, as well as just needing more food. So some of the things that come out of it, one of the things that was a bit surprising to us when we first built it is if we look at protein, which people talk about as we're going to need lots more protein by 2050, 70% is a figure that's often quoted. There's actually enough protein produced globally to feed the 2050 population if we shared it equally. But of course we don't. There's differential access to protein between countries and within countries. And so that's a challenge. But it's there as a base thing. Is we already produce enough protein if it was under an ideal scenario, if it was shared equally amongst people. And that holds true for lysine too, which is the most limiting of the essential amino acids. When we look at the historic data, we can actually start to develop a picture about some of that distribution. This is the distribution for protein, cumulative for people on the y-axis, and a sufficiency score on the bottom. So the black line is getting enough, and everything below the black line, this 600 million people or so are in countries where, as nations, they don't have enough protein to meet the needs of their population, let alone consider any disparity within nations that further disadvantages people. So we can see that whilst we nominally have enough to feed everyone, we've actually got a gap we would need to close just to meet needs now. Okay, normally we sit at 36% above the line. We actually need to increase by another % just to meet the needs of that group underneath. And that starts to colour also our thinking around what we need to do from a food system perspective. Okay, so I've just given you a really quick introduction. Key point I want you to take away from what I'm saying is that sustainable nutrition must be at the heart of conversations around the future of food. We can learn a lot by data and models. What we try and do is create models that you can play with. You can approach us, get access to this on the website, have a go for yourself. It's a complex area, and models are really powerful tools. Our collaborators, a number of places, and thank you. Contact information is here. Just sustainablenutritioninitiative.com is our email address, our website address.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And we'll make all of the presentations available to everybody within a few days, of course, so you'll be able to get that information. I'm now looking forward to being able to invite Professor Julia Blanchard to give the next presentation. So just while she loads up, Julia is at IMAS, University of Tasmania, and her presentation is Future of Fish Supply Under Climate Change. So here we go.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Am I sharing the right screen, Chris?
No, I think if you share the other screen.
Got it?
Great, thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm also going to talk about modeling as well. I'm going to share some of the results of a large project called the sorry, I'm having some difficulty moving forward here. Okay, called the Fisheries and Marine Ecosystem Model Intercomparison Project. So getting into this, I'm going to tell you what that is first. I'm going to show you some of the most recent results that we have for the Australian EEZ biomass projections. And I'm going to talk about what this might mean for Australian seafood. And so just getting back to the title of my talk, The Future of Fish Supply Under Climate Change. So what we do in FishMIP is bring together lots of different global models of marine ecosystems. And these models are coupled to Earth system models that tell us a lot about the future of the planet under climate change scenarios. And so what we aim to do here is generate ensemble projections for marine ecosystems to help us answer questions about the future of fish and fisheries, seafood supply, marine biodiversity, and marine ecosystem functioning. And if you're interested in this program, FishMIP, you can find more about what we're doing on the website given below, www.fishmip.org. But I should say it's a growing network of about 110, I think, on our last count, researchers from all around the world working together on this. So our current model ensemble consists of 9 global marine ecosystem models and about 20 plus regional ecosystem models that allow you to dig down into the detail. And I think Beth Fulton will talk a little bit more about those kind of models a bit later. The reason why we use model ensembles is because this allows us to synthesize our collective understanding of all the different processes that control ultimately how to get from small plants in the ocean all the way up to the largest marine predators and fisheries. And so this happens in lots of different ways. There's no single way to model a marine ecosystem. So we bring all of these models together to allow us to capture the uncertainty that we have in our discipline around marine ecology and fisheries. And while our work is on the fisheries and marine ecosystem sector, we also contribute to kind of an umbrella organization called the Intersectoral Impact Model Intercomparison Project, or EasyMIP. And all of our simulations are aligned and standardized so that we can look both within our sectors and across sectors and be able to report to policy documents like the IPCC about future of climate hazards, vulnerability assessment, and adaptation plans to different parts of the world. I've given a range of some of the models up here, some of the global models, as well as some of the regional models. And my team leads on one global model, the one in pink, DBPM, as well as a framework used for regional ecosystem modeling called MISR. Our most recent projections that are under what's called CMIP, so these went into the most recent 6 IPCC assessment, showed that there was substantial global decline in potential biomass, and this is all of marine animal biomass, with a large amount of regional variation. So you see on the map here, this is the the no mitigation scenario, where we've got a mixture of increases and decreases in red around the globe, with some of those very strong decreases happening for most of the low latitude areas in the world, where a lot of the food production is extremely crucial. And this projection, which you can see also through time on the upper panel with the time series, is more pessimistic than our previous projections that happened in the fifth round of the IPCC. We can also see large uncertainties. Those are the envelopes around these projections. And so the question that I wanted to look at today is, what do these projections hold for in terms of Australia? So if we zoom in a bit, we're going to zoom in on the Australian EEZ areas. And also we're going to zoom in on what I'm calling exploitable fish biomass. So this is the biomass of all fish that span within the size range of 10 grams to 100 kilograms. And so what we see here are projections under two scenarios. One on the left, SSP 126, is under strong climate mitigations. That's reducing emissions and keeping warming within 2 degrees. And then on the right is the no mitigation scenario. That's going ahead with current levels of emissions. And so what we see for a lot of the Australian EEZs, the sort of the grid cells around Australia, is that up to 60% decline in this exploitable fish biomass under the no mitigation scenario, which is obviously quite concerning. And compared to the strong mitigation, we can see that reduces the loss of this reduction, with some of the most negative impacts with mitigation still being concerning, but at least not going below a decline of minus 30%. Now, if we look at the spatial average of the whole mainland Australian exclusive economic zone, we can also see some interesting patterns. And that's that the differences between these two scenarios emerge around 2045. And that the average losses across mainland Australian EEZ are up to 20% by 2050 under that no mitigation scenario. So what could this mean for Australian seafood? So first of all, strong benefits for reducing emissions and warming on potential seafood supply. Also highlights, even with strong mitigation, the need for climate adaptive fisheries moving into the future. It suggests that, questions about the stable supply of domestic wild-caught seafood, given that the ceiling of this supply is falling, and what that could mean for things like price and whether we could meet demand, which is raised by Andrew's talk earlier. These are going to be big challenges in the future. I showed you the full size range of mostly what would be human direct consumption seafood, but there are losses also in the smaller size ranges, which even would affect aquaculture feeds, for example. High across model uncertainty in our projections, but these are still probably quite conservative estimates, as they do not actually include things like the impacts of fishing or the impacts on demersal habitat like reefs, and indeed the coral reef and coral bleaching and habitat change will be quite massively effective under these climate scenarios as well. Additionally, it points to the need of more integrative understanding of climate impacts in the face of this growing human demand and impacts across all of the food sectors. And that's something that the project that I'm working on as part of my ARC Future Fellowship aims to do. And as part of the next and current, indeed, round of FishMap, which we're calling FishMap 2.0, is to integrate some of those drivers of demand. So In terms of past change, we're integrating historical human use in the oceans, particularly fishing activity, to enable us to carry out detailed model evaluation and assess the reliability of our model projections. And in the future, we're incorporating human use scenarios under different future scenarios. So that's incorporating some of the demand scenarios that emerge under population growth and demography, the sort of stuff that Andrew was showing as well, but in a dynamic sense. So I'm going to stop there and move on to any questions in the next speaker. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Julia. We'll leave the questions until the end, of course.
Okay.
And
Great.
very nice to kind of, well, I don't know about nice. Very insightful to see the impacts. And now we move to the next talk, which is given by Dr. Anna Farmery from University of Wollongong. And Anna's going to be talking about identifying management actions for a food-based approach to fisheries and aquaculture. So Anna, I'll hand over to you. Thank you. We can't hear you, Anna.
Unmute. Sorry.
That's yep.
Is that working?
Excellent.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm going to talk a bit about the potential that we have to manage fisheries and aquaculture better for food. So I'll talk a bit about aquatic foods, but we've got a few different terms flying around: seafood or aquatic foods, or Rich is talking about blue foods, and they're all basically the same thing, I guess. It's talking about plants and animals from fresh and marine waters, which we know can be highly nutritious and can have a lower footprint than some land-based foods. And because of this, aquatic foods have been identified as having a real potential to help transition food systems to be more healthy and sustainable than they currently are, because we know there's major environmental impacts from current food production, and globally hunger's increasing. And in Australia, we've got a not insignificant number of people who are food insecure. And this potential for aquatic food has been increasingly advocated at a high level. For example, Shakuntala Thilsted, who was the winner of the 2021 World Food Prize at the UN Food Systems Summit, asked every member state to make the most of their aquatic food systems for sustainable and healthy diets. So my question is, are we making the most of our aquatic food systems? And the truth is that in many cases, as well in Australia, we really just don't know. So here I have compiled a complete list of the Commonwealth, state and fisheries legislation, policies and plans that acknowledge that food is being produced. Aquaculture is doing slightly better. The National Aquaculture Strategy mentions that aquaculture contributes to seafood demand. And the reason that food production is not mentioned in these policies is because that fisheries and aquaculture are really managed for economic gains and minimising environmental impacts alongside different social goals, rather than being managed as part of a food system. And does that matter? Does it matter if food isn't mentioned in these regulations? As long as we are producing food that's sustainable, that's economically viable, are we all good? Or are we actually missing some key opportunities and possibly even undermining the potential of fisheries and aquaculture to contribute to more healthy and sustainable food systems? So this is a question that I'm looking at through my ARC DECRA research with the help of Liam Fulbrook. And we've been exploring this topic by looking at ideas from research and from practice on how you might go about taking a food-based approach to fisheries and aquaculture management. This work's ongoing, but I wanted to present a few of the ideas that we've been looking at. So one of them is maximising production. So maximising food outcomes in fisheries and aquaculture by maximising production, which is basically what we're doing at the moment. In fisheries, maximum sustainable yield is a common target in which catch is maximised, and there's also opportunities to increase catch over time through better management of fisheries that are overfished and subject to illegal fishing. And for aquaculture, maximising production is being sought through things like fast-growing species, feed efficiency, and intensification of production. And this approach to maximise production really follows the assumption that the more food we produce, the more that's available to eat and to meet growing demand. And while production is really a key part of the story, it doesn't, increasing food availability doesn't consider other dimensions of food systems like the distribution and access, affordability and utilisation. And it doesn't consider if the people who could really benefit the most from seafood in their diets are going to benefit from a general increase in production. And this maximising production also doesn't consider the nutritional aspects of products. And this concept of maximising nutrients from fisheries and aquaculture is another approach potentially to maximising food. Some aquatic foods are much more nutritious than others, but fish aren't targeted based on their nutrition profile. And the result is in fisheries that the total nutrients coming out of a fishery reflects the nutrient content of the most targeted and abundant stocks. And so it is possibly lower than it could be. And one approach to address this is to increase fishing of the most nutritious species. And some researchers have had a go at looking at how this might work. For example, Robinson and team developed a framework to estimate multi-species maximum nutrient yield, MNY. But an issue that is faced in this targeting fish for their nutrient content is that they potentially might not be popular with consumers who don't want to purchase those fish, so it'll make it not viable for the fishers. Aquaculture is a bit of a similar situation, that the most nutritious species aren't always the ones that are prioritised for farming and might not be the ones that are sought by consumers. But the feed that goes into aquaculture can really influence the nutrient profile of the fish. And there's a potential to supplement fish diets for human health. But currently the focus is on supplementing diets for fish growth and fish health performance. And there's really few incentives to take human health into account. We've also been looking at maximising sustainability and the links to food systems. And here I'll just quickly focus on marine protected areas. While these can really benefit food production, particularly where stocks are heavily overfished, there can be big trade-offs between conservation and food provision, which are currently not well understood or managed. So MPAs don't automatically lead to increased food outcomes. They really need to be implemented carefully with consideration of local food impacts. Another thing we've been looking at is reducing systems loss. So not just at production, but across the whole food supply chain. And this includes things like increasing the use of edible byproducts that are currently going to waste, and also the idea of directing more fish to human consumption rather than to fish feed. And this has been the trend over time as fed aquaculture has reduced its reliance on wild fish, but food-grade fish are still being used in aquaculture. And changing this situation can be complicated as it's an effect of economics and feed requirements and a range of other things. And it can also be complicated by locked-in effects. As an example, where fleet structures have changed over time towards fewer, larger vessels that need to really maximise their catch to maximise value. And if it were to change so that smaller catches were available for local sale of fresh fish, it would really require a shift in fisheries regulations. Some of the other areas we've been and we will start exploring is the concept of adaptable and resilient production, or climate sensitive fisheries that allow for flexibility in management. And these are really going to be critical for dealing with uncertainty in the future and maintaining stable food supply. We've also been looking at supporting local fish economies and incentives for local production and markets to increase food access. Another issue is recognising fish as food. Fish or aquatic foods really not well recognised within health and diet policy at the moment. And so there needs to be a stronger link between the fisheries, aquaculture and health sectors. We've also been looking at concepts of fairness and self-sufficiency, ensuring that fisheries and aquaculture abide by codes of conduct for equity, gender, human rights, and also support agency, or the ability for people to support themselves through fishing and farming, and especially around encouraging culturally important fishing. And lastly, we've been looking at the link between production and consumption, particularly around demand for nutritious food, where nutritious species aren't always those that are the most popular with consumers. So as I said, this research is ongoing, and we would really like to hear from you, particularly if you're working in this area or if you're involved in fisheries and aquaculture management or on the ground, then please do get in touch. Thanks, Chris.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you for setting out some of the challenges and also providing some interesting commentary and solutions. So
I am, don't you worry.
thank you. All right, well, so moving to the next talk then, we've got Professor John Bowman, who's Professor at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture, University of Tasmania. And John's going to talk about Centre for Food Safety and Innovation, future prospects in food-related research and development in Tasmania. So thank you, John.
Can you see the presentation?
We can see, and yeah.
Okay.
Great.
So, hello everybody. I'm a microbiologist who works at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture, University of Tasmania, and I lead the Centre for Food Safety and Innovation. But for this talk, I'll focus on essentially, I guess, the future in terms of R&D that we are doing in our particular neck of the wood in basically Tasmania. Just to give you a feel what it might be like in the future in terms of the space, in particular Tasmania, which is a bit of a breadbasket in terms of Australia, as we get a good portion of the water, for example, which actually sustains the green agriculture. And of course, we're very active in the blue sector as well, and also in the non-food sector. So, for example, wool, pyrethrum, poppy alkaloids, these sorts of things. So the Tasmanian government has a goal called AgriVision 2050, where they want to have $10 billion of farm gate or beach gate production within the next basically 25 years or so, which is quite an ambitious goal since they need to basically triple the output effectively. And of course, we have to do this in the context of a sustainable system. So this is going to be a substantial challenge in terms of basically, making this possible. At the moment, there's a strong reliance on commodities, and there's some degree of value addition through processing. Some food industries are more related or more affected by or more, say, get more value from processing compared to others. So, for example, the production of salmonids, we only get around 15% increase in value. So R&D is probably going to be necessary to extract greater value from food in terms of the whole spectrum of its needs. So protein, calorie, nutrition, and all this sort of stuff, as well as, of course, the hedonic aspects, the pleasure aspect, as well as the fact we have to think of it in a sustainable sense. So this is a major challenge for the future, and food safety innovation is just one aspect. Of course, we've got the pre-farm gate research as well, for many of these different sort of commodities. And TIA is basically spread all over of Tasmania, and we're going to be moving our headquarters to Launceston, where a lot of food industry is sort of concentrated in the north of the state, basically. But it's still, of course, it occurs all through the Midlands through to the south, and we have a big irrigation scheme as well in Tasmania, so supporting the green part of the green sector. But of course, we've got the agriculture sector as well. So in terms of the CFSI, our activities are spread across the entire sector, both blue and green, effectively. Because it's food, basically. So, assessing the actual types of research we're doing includes many different aspects, but of course, there's only a small group, so we can't do everything. And I remember from Andrew Fletcher's huge diagram it's the Byzantine sort of connections. Obviously, R&D is only possible to a certain finite degree. Now, some of the areas that we focus in are assessing, improving food safety, which includes both pre and post-harvest interventions, predictive modelling, particularly associated with food safety by microbial hazards, quantitative risk assessment, which is needed particularly when you're having new products going onto the market or new processes. And I'm going to focus a bit more on the quality and stabilisation of perishable food, because this is where you can get actual added value, because of course it's also much more storable and transferable. And also you don't have to rely on things like the cold chain as much. So I'll talk about some of the work that we're doing very briefly on innovative processing and approaches for value addition. And there's a whole lot more to this story, like there's supply chain, surveillance, logistics. I know that AMC at the University of Tasmania does work in the logistics area. And then there's the whole circular economy as well. So, for example, in food safety, we can do things in a relatively simple way to improve the value of seafood products. So, for example, to be able to have safe seafood products, because they are affected by things like parasites, bacterial contamination potentially, like listeria. Also, you might want to do things like live egg disinfection, as well as achieve stability, which increases the shelf life of the product and thus reducing waste. The idea is to try and do this in a way that we have minimal processing, that's safe, there's no residue, low cost, all the various market demands which are prevalent these days, which are just part of the overall mega trends that we see in food, and food consumption, globally. So, for example, we did research to try and replace exclusive chlorine using for the purposes of processing seafood, like for example salmon fillets. And this is a similar motivation in other food industries like the poultry, meat industry. And the idea is, of course, to improve safety, quality, stability of the products. And so using some things, or relatively simple and well-established technologies like electrolyzed water, which you can generate on-site, you can achieve these sorts of things. So this is an active area of research across the food industry to try to achieve better food stability, better safety, and then in the end, a better way to transfer food from one point to another in a way that also hopefully mitigates against waste and loss of food through the supply chain, which is a big issue. And indeed, in Tasmania, and of course everywhere else, there's a lot of produce that's produced. I'm talking about produce across both seafood, plant and meat, livestock-based products, dairy products. There's a significant proportion which is of lower reject grade. So things that you don't see in the shop, stuff that doesn't make it to the end of that retail supply chain. In addition, Tasmania being an island, it's expensive to ship with the cold chain. It's actually 40% more expensive. So if you can generate value by actually processing the food in such a way that you can retain things like nutrition, the quality, like the flavor, the taste, and various other aspects of food that that people demand, as well as pets demand, because there's a huge market in what we call humanized pet foods. This market in Australia has tripled since 2010, the size of that market. So your pets also are demanding high quality food too. They're part of the family. And to do this, we have various novel, innovative technologies that we're applying. So at the moment, we have a collaboration with Defence Service Technology Group. They have a facility in Scottsdale in northeast Tasmania, and we have a pilot plant which basically can create sterile food or pasteurized food, thermally pasteurized food, to provide shelf-stable chilled products, involving the use of microwaves, microwave-assisted thermal sterilization, or MATS. And this essentially is a very big microwave oven, so it's not quite like the ones you have in your kitchen. This can actually generate sterile products within less than 2 minutes. And so the goal is to try to eventually get this to a full-scale meal production plant. And this type of technology allows us to do lots of different things with food, not just very specific things, but actually, whole meal preparation and and other sophisticated things that could attract larger amounts of value from raw commodities or semi-processed commodities. And of course, this will go along with other types of technologies, which of course assist this. So, for example, technologies of advancing in food packaging, which there's many innovations in this area. Advanced flavor protection, which is often associated with the food packaging and the processing method, as well as other types of areas like freeze drying. There's the Stable Food Group in Tasmania, which has a very large freeze drying facility at Evandale, which is near the airport in Launceston, to be able to produce freeze-dried food. And of course, there's a whole lot of technology that goes along with this to try to provide evidence, for example, that maybe the industry can use for quality assessment in an objective manner. So for things like, for example, sensory analysis using electronic devices like the electronic tongue, which basically can sort of replace sensory panels, which has been the traditional way, as well as advanced chemical types of methods, like, for example, GC mass spectrometry, as well as other types of chromatography that provides very sophisticated analytical chemical analysis of food. And in our group, Professor Rob Shelley is currently working at Defence CSIRO, will join here and will lead a group in the innovation space in the food chemistry side of the spectrum. And into the future, we might be printing food on demand, like you might be printing your salmon or your hamburger or pizza, like, for example, not quite like Star Trek, but sort of something sort of equivalent. It'll sort of pop into it will sort of be ordered on demand. But this is, of course, a long way away to be something at a commercial level, that people can use. And you probably heard about stories of artificial meat and these sorts of things, but they'll still need feedstocks that will come from the green and blue economy. It's not like they're just created by some form of sort of chemical and chemistry. It actually still requires input from production systems to do things like this. And so that's the talk, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And I'm pretty sure we went from being locally informative and relevant right up into space. So well done for achieving that. stellar performance, so to speak. Right, we're still just trying to work on Richard's presentation. So unfortunately, Beth Fulton is here next to be able to give the next presentation. So Beth is known to many of you. She's a senior principal research scientist at CSIRO, and Beth is going to talk about coping with complex seafood futures, one bite at a time. So Beth, welcome.
I'll start off by acknowledging the elders of the lands that we live on and pay my personal respect to those. So what you're going to hear from me today is a quick summary of a few different projects that we're using to try and make sure that the future of seafood is an informed one, both in understanding the current state of the system, but also moving forward. I'm sorry I missed Julia's talk earlier, but hopefully it'll have some touch points with hers. How are we going, Leslie?
Your slides are just taking a little while to load. I'm nearly there.
So I'll launch into the basic concept of what it is. So if you can imagine everything that we've done on land for the last 10,000 years or so, we're now doing that in the water. So it's a very complicated space. It's not just about increased seafood production. So the next slide, please, Leslie. It's about everything else that sits around that as well, which means it's a very complicated space for decision makers, not just producers like fishers and aquaculturalists, but the managers and other users of that space that have to work around it. Next slide, please. So one of the things that you need to steer your way through that is that there's not going to be any one tool that's going to provide all the information that you need from operational scale to planning scale. So I'm just going to lightly touch on 3 different approaches here that are being worked on actively by researchers in Australia and overseas, including members of the CRC. So the first one of those is around operations, particularly around trying to find adaptation options as the ecosystem changes under climate change, increasing the forecast technology capacity. So we're really good at forecast right now if it's really short term, if you think about the weather, or if it's really long term, decades away. That's why we can trust climate models. But the intermediate is the place that we're just starting to get on top of. It's a tricky mix of the human part of the system and the physical part. So that's why it can be a bit complex to think about. The second one is around assessments and models into the future. And the last one is around trying to understand your management options. Okay, next slide, please, Leslie. Okay, so we start off with the adaptation handbook. This was one for fisheries that was completed a couple of years ago and is now being rolled out with all of the state jurisdictions. It was originally developed along with the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, so fishers and managers were a strong part of how this handbook works, and an aquaculture one hopefully will start in 2024. So the ideas behind it is that we have forecasts of what the physical, and we have observations of what the physical world is doing. So whether it's temperature change, deoxygenation, stratification, acidification, all the things that are changing in the physical environment. We look to see what the ecological response is. So in a wild capture state, that's what is the species doing? Is it moving? Is it changing the time of the year that it spawns? Is it changing physical conditions, so product quality? Aquaculture will be pretty similar, though it might come down to what you want to grow in a specific location or not. The second step's about understanding what the producers themselves can do to adapt. That's called autonomous change. There's lots of different options, at least 10 to 14 large options, including at the most extreme leaving an industry, but there's lots of other things like changing what you're producing, value adding to it in the ways that we've just heard, looking at different markets, even down to communicating with consumers about why change is needed. So there's a wide range of options there. There's even more options on the management side. So the management sits within an adaptive management loop. This is more clearly seen in fisheries with their annual decision-making as well as their long-term decision-making cycles, but it's true of aquaculture and landscape and coastal planning as well. So the idea behind trying to find the management adaptation steps is to look at what will maintain sustainability and increasingly a circular blue economy while not undermining the autonomous adaptation. So it's about getting rid of kinds of policy and management that's going to stand in the way and not help, while still having the right brakes and the right levers in place to avoid unintended consequences. Because there's lots of times when what looks good in the short term actually isn't going to be very helpful in the long term. Thanks, Leslie. Next slide, please. And there's a little bit of a sense of that here, where the current actions are often reactionary or monitoring or just watching, whereas the future action is likely to have to be much more proactive, getting very specific responses and often finer scale on response to technology changes and things like that. That's because the speed of change is increasing quite rapidly. So Julia might have touched on it, but if we think about the level of climate change that's happened over the last 70 years, that degree of climate change is expected again in the next 20. So we have a lot of change coming. Next slide, please. So one of the ways of considering that future is through what's called socio-ecological modelling. So people might be familiar with the idea of modelling a single species or a small number of species and the environment they sit in, but you can build out those models to include the whole ecosystem, the climate drivers, all the different users of the system and how they make their decisions and what influences their costs and what influences their social processes. And by doing that whole system, you can find the leverage points that if you press on it, you can get quite substantial change and try and anticipate any unintended consequences of development or management options that you might put in place. Next slide, please. So a lot of times in business now, they use what's called scenarios or foresighting. That's used in science and lots of other fields in the military, for instance, as well. Models have a role in that because the human imagination can think up things that just are physically impossible. Over the course of the last year, I've spent a lot of time with fishermen within Australia, but also internationally, sitting through and talking through what those kind of futures might look like. And every meeting, there's at least one idea that sounds really good in theory, but is actually physically breaks the laws of the way the universe works. So you use models to try and constrain the limits of that possible in that cone, and that way you can explore those other different scenarios, the different trajectories that you can see. Now, that might be trying to explain what's plausible. So what are the ones that are most likely to occur? What are the ones that are probable? The one that right in the center there, that would be where your current path is going, where there might be intervention points that create a split, like the bifurcation, or whether your preferable scenario is something different again and how you actually get there. Next slide, please. So one of the things that can help that is to understand how the system has changed already. And this is an example from Southeast Australia, where there's a paper just coming out, or has just come out, discussing how these models were used in a counterfactual sense to say, look, if climate change hadn't worked, would the fishery look like it does today? And the simple answer was no. It looks like some of the species would not be as heavily impacted as they currently appear to be without climate change. So that gives fisheries, and equally good aquacultural production in that area, some understanding of how that environmental change is having a footprint on their day-to-day activities, and where that can mean that what might look like a good idea in principle is actually going to be prevented because of that physical change. Next slide, please. Looking into the future, you can use the same kind of models to look at different options. So this is actually an example from the Great Barrier Reef, but this kind of approach has been used around the world, where you have a representation of the natural world, in this case, a particular population of fish and the habitat it uses, dynamic representation of the human use, so in this case fisheries, but could equally be aquaculture production. And then you've got the management controls on top. So you replay history, which is the grey parts, and then you project forward under the different management options, and they're the different coloured lines. And around those different options, you can discuss the pros and cons across lots of people's objectives. So they can be economic objectives, production objectives, but social and cultural objectives too, like, you know, jobs, employment, the kind of demographics supported, what it does for cultural values for First Nations groups. So you can really start to explore that multi-dimensional space and understand how production sits in that bigger complex of how we're using the ocean. Next slide, please. This one's going to be a little bit tricky, Leslie. If it's a normal computer, you should be able to press it down twice. Just get them going. Yeah, that'd be great. And the other one too. So these two videos give you that bigger picture for Gladstone Harbour. It was done a few years back now, but we basically created a video that matched what the model said about both sides of the world to help people visualise those virtual worlds. Given Australia's struggle with numeracy and literacy, this has proved a more effective way of trying to describe it. So on the left-hand side, they get on top of catchment management. There's a mitigation of climate impacts. And the water remains clear. There's a lot more of the kinds of fish that people like to recreational fish. There's charismatic megafauna. It just comes off as more desirable. Whereas on the other side, there was a perturbed system where there wasn't as great catchment management. Climate effects hadn't been mitigated to the same effect. And there was a lot more algal overgrowth. The water's a lot cloudier from flooding. And the large scale, pretty much the only animal that benefited was sharks. They could eat and scavenge. So it was an interesting outcome. But it gave people a sense of what those futures could look like. And aquaculture and other forms of production can sit easily within that. Next slide, please. You might have to hit it 3 times to get past the videos. Leslie, one more time. Thank you. Okay, the last part of it is to consider how management might need to actually change. So for about the last 150 years, most of fisheries management, but definitely in the last 100 years, fisheries management has been based on the idea of maximum sustainable yield. It actually comes out of forestry in plantations in Germany in the 1800s. It was leapt onto for legal reasons post-World War II, and it's been known since the 1990s, you can't actually do it. It might be a great way to run a farm. You can't run an ecosystem that way, particularly one under climate change. So a lot of what people had to do when management of seafood was first introduced had to assume static equilibrium conditions because they were doing the calculations by hand. Now, these days we have computers, we understand complex systems a lot better. So there's a lot of options that people are talking about for things in that world, including dynamic reference points, but also starting to look at the structure and function of ecosystems as a part of the blue economy rather than just snapshot conditions. So there's a whole body of work that's starting to take off. And for anyone who's at the World Fisheries Congress next year, I think you'll get a good sense of that, around taking a bigger picture view of how you manage fisheries and seafood production more generally that marries conservation and fisheries together. So those two worlds are no longer pitted against each other. Indeed, to be honest, all of the users in the blue economy will have to work together, which is why you get things like this CRC, where the energy and aquaculture have paired up to find some win-wins. Next slide, please. So in summary, it's a really complex world, but it's going to be a world based around the ocean. It's kind of the last frontier that hasn't been exploited to the same degree. So people are going to move there. So getting it on a stable footing, a sustainable footing, so that we don't make the same mistakes we've made on land is a really positive way to approach that future. There's a lot of tools that we'll need for that, and hopefully across the course of the talks you've heard today, you'll get a sense of that, not just from mine, but from everybody else as well. And that can provide that new approach, that systems view that gives flexibility and agility to really respond and have a really productive future. And most importantly, be able to do that when you're dealing with uncertainty. Now, one of the most complicated parts of that I didn't have a chance to talk about today is actually human psychology, and having to rethink some of the decisions and break down some of the simple rules that humans use when we make decisions. But that's a whole other talk, so I'll leave that for another day. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Beth. That was as insightful as ever and really just perfect in terms of where we're at with the seminar. So I think we'll move straight on to Julie Petty from Seafood Industry Australia. And Julie's going to talk about the age of advocacy. So if we could move to Julie, please.
Thanks, Chris. I think the host has stopped my video, so I'm not able to turn that back on.
Oh, I'm sure Leslie will sort that out as soon as she gets to it.
No worries. Oh, here we go.
Great.
Afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining the discussion this afternoon. Hopefully you're all sitting in a nice air-conditioned room, not sweltering it out like we are in Queensland. So my name is Julie Petty. I work with Seafood Industry Australia. We are the national peak representative body for the entire seafood industry, wild catch and aquaculture. The organisation's only about 6 or so years old, and industry actually called for its formation after having a number of years with no lead body working in that advocacy space at a national level. So they recognised that there was definitely a gap there, and certainly seeing some increasing pressure coming under the industry from a number of different directions, for which national advocacy had a role in place in helping to move through those challenges. I guess I would see advocacy as a two-pronged approach. So there's the role that we all play as advocates being employed within the seafood industry. And by that, I mean, this Christmas when you're at the family barbecue and you've got the random uncle asking you, what do you do? We all have the opportunity there to be an advocate for the industry, for our career pathway, for the species that we might be working with. And it's an opportunity to communicate, to raise awareness and correct some misconceptions that might exist out there. So that's one part of advocacy, and certainly something that we can all do and all participate in. Advocacy is also, I guess, something that at a national level, organisations such as Seafood Industry Australia and our peer groups across other different sectors work in, very much looking at understanding the issues and challenges facing industry, looking to best understand how what we need from policy and decision makers to help industry adjust or move through those, or better understand legislation or policy that might be coming forward. This is most certainly the age of advocacy. A great example is around country of origin labelling. So hopefully you all saw in the last couple of weeks, we had a great win. It's taken over 15 years worth of advocacy from people all across the entire industry, campaigning for country of origin labelling at retail in food service, so that a consumer who's ordering fish and chips on a Saturday can have better transparency about where that product is coming from. That's a direct result of advocacy. And certainly something that'll have wonderful benefits both for the consumer and industry. Advocacy is also around putting forward, I guess, communication and intelligence around what our industry is and what we are not. So certainly there's lots of detractors of our industry out there who are very well organised and well funded, and that's who we're sort of up against, and who we are, I guess, providing an alternative messaging to some of that stuff. And I think that's where the interaction between research development and advocacy is increasingly important. So research and development can only take us so far. We need to better connect some of those results and the fantastic work that happens in research, linking that through to activation and advocacy. If you take, for example, the Futures of Seafood program, which has recently been announced, that's a program that's been initiated by the Blue Economy CRC and Seafood Industry Australia, with a variety of different funding coming in from a variety of different organisations. It's very much looking at holistically pulling together a lot of the research, development, data inputs that we have had over a number of years, pulling that together in such a way that allows us to forward forecast cumulative impacts of policy and legislative change. So that's a great example of linking the skill sets that people in advocacy and people in research can bring when working together. That project's looking at having significant impact through to the seafood industry, because essentially we may be able to better forecast cumulative impacts of different international decisions or agreements that are being made by the Australian government, looking at the cumulative impacts of things like climate change and modelling there, and looking at how we can use that better information to change our fisheries management systems and operations, update those so that now when licenses are being handed out, or there's real on-ground impact and changes that we can make by having better intelligence fed through R&D that is advocated well and communicated in a way that that is really clear back to our policy decision makers. I think my final point regarding that is that this is such a wonderful opportunity, as I mentioned, for every individual to be a better advocate for their industry, for their sector, especially over the Christmas period. Lots of myths to bust as you're munching down on those prawns on Christmas Day. And it's also an opportunity, I guess, for us to have more of a united front moving forward as an industry, and looking at that well-founded good research as the foundation basis to back up our advocacy and communication claims. So thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you, and what a great message. So thank you. Of course, I'd like to thank all of our speakers and invite them to become part of a panel so we can just look at some of the questions that have come up. I'd first of all just like to thank Gregor for asking several questions. I think your questions are really interesting and give several members of the panel opportunities to answer those. So, probably several people could answer each one of them. Perhaps if we go to the one at the top of the list, or my list anyway, addressed to Julie. So on the journey to country of origin labelling over those 15 years, what was the most impactful driver that got policymakers on board to adopt it? So maybe Julie first, and then anybody else who'd like to consider that one.
So SIA has only been involved in that campaign, obviously, right towards the end, seeing as we've only been around for 6 years, and that campaign took at least 15. I think certainly the ongoing persistence and having a relatively united front coming through from industry around these are the impacts to our end consumers, that we think will be beneficial, and communicating those clearly to policymakers. I think it's also been really beneficial coming to the party in the more recent negotiations with a simple solution. So looking at, rather than necessarily going the full hog and listing every single possible country of origin, keeping it relatively simple for food service sectors has helped us manage some of their concerns around ongoing cost.
Great, thank you. I don't know if any of our panelists would also like to enter an opinion about that question. Perhaps whilst we're thinking about that, we could just move to the second question there, which is addressed to Julia. And so Julia, what do you think is the single biggest driver of the decline in Australian regions? And is there just a shift in exploitable seafood to cooler climates?
Hi, thanks for that question. Yeah, so it's not just a single driver, and it's certainly not, I'm going to put in quotation marks, just the effect of sort of species shifts due to warming, but changes in the, I think I answered another question about, the tiny primary producers and plants that form the base of marine food webs, combined with that warming is what's driving most of the decline from our model projections. Now, of course, in reality, there's a combination of things going on. Beth alluded to the fact that, there's human impacts happening to these ecosystems as well, which would make them, maybe not as resilient to those changes affecting the base of the food web and the warming and whatnot. And one of the big features that's also missing in our models that I mentioned is the absence of the benthic habitat and the reefs, which obviously will compound these drivers and risks. So it's quite hard to get to kind of get to a single driver, because it's this complex system where everything's interacting, and sometimes those you can have 2 or 3 or even more things making the risk even larger than you would expect if you were just to add them together.
Thank you. And any other panel member?
Yeah, if I just jump in, Chris, just backing up what Julia said. So we, in the regional models around countries, they have started to put in benthic groups already, and they often suffer even more quickly than the pelagic stocks that Julia talked about. The pelagic stuff, the stuff up in the water column, can move. Stuff that's sitting on the bottom can't move as easily. It tends to either move slowly as an adult or mainly through juvenile and larvae moving. So what you see is that not only is there a drop in primary productivity, but the habitats are affected. The ocean loss of oxygen sort of starts at the bottom and moves to the top. So there's a lot of factors interacting there. It's not an all one-way story, though, because of those confounding factors. You can get what's called a novel ecosystem arise, which is a brand new mix of species that we haven't observed before. Now, they may be transitioning through a dip as they get used to living with each other, so to speak. So there is the possibility that some locations will benefit, often in the temperate zones, as you've identified, but it's such a new area because the ocean's being taken back to conditions it hasn't seen for like 1 million years or more. So understanding what their world's like is really complex, which is why we're trying to find ways that remain flexible to that change through time rather than locking things in.
Right, thank you. So I think we'll move to another question. So Loresa's posed an interesting question here. Amazing presentations, thank you everyone. What interest, if any, is the finance sector showing in your work? So let's go with the suggested speakers there. Julia?
I'm not aware of the finance sector showing direct interest in our work. Although I'd certainly like the sort of the research funding side of thing to pan out, because this science does take years to develop. However, been at a couple of workshops over the past 5 years or so, and there's more and more, insurance companies, people working in risk and adaptation and that sort of thing coming on board. And I'm also aware of, published papers which try to communicate how finance works to, for example, ecologists like myself, which is, a bridge I think that needs to kind of be overcome to work on these better ways of assessing risk, I think, together.
Thank you. I don't know, Anna or Beth, if you've got any.
There has been a little bit, again, not direct, it's largely in partnership with fisheries, where bank managers and others have come to ask questions. But the place it's starting to pick up more, and we're probably likely to see more discussion going further, is the task force around climate disclosures and the nature disclosures, so your biodiversity disclosures. Both of those are seeing much more interest in what the biodiversity and climate footprint on all industries are, including fisheries and seafood production. So I think it's a space where we're going to see more and more activity. And it looks like Julie wants to answer too.
Right, over to Julie.
Thank you. I was just going to add, I think the finance sector and others are taking a lot of notice. If you think about the recent announcement by Westpac that they'll no longer be lending to any primary producer involved in deforestation, which is a very general kind of term there, people are taking notice. So there's an opportunity, I guess, for us to be quite conscious of that, those perceptions, and how we get on the front foot to tackle those kinds of decisions.
Right, thank you. I put Andrew on the spot. I mean, I'm not sure if you have financial institutions who are involved in the Riddet Institute.
So we have had conversations, and one of our advisory panel has just recently finished a very successful and high-level career at Rabobank. The lenders who are involved in the food system are very interested in this topic of the future of food. They need to, because they've got to deal with the people that are investing money with them, and the whole climate disclosures and all the other environmental disclosures, and they need to be mapping a path to the future. They're in some ways strongly future focused, because they're looking at how sustainable is their lending portfolio, what is the risk attached to it, and how does that play out in terms of the good that is providing back to society. And so bringing this picture of nutrition back into this conversation of food is kind of important for people who are lending money in the food sector.
Right, thank you. And I think Anna is the last person, then she's got her hand up. So Anna.
Yeah, just quickly to add, I guess I haven't had any interaction with financial institutions themselves, but where we work in the policy space in different countries in the Pacific and Timor-Leste in a sort of food system policy space, we do work across different sectors, and finance and commerce are definitely involved in those negotiations.
Right, so thank you. An important question, and a nice set of comprehensive answers across that. So just moving theme a bit, there's a question from Damien here, and probably John would be the first person, but of course other panel members after. So John, how confident can we be that fishes processed by sterilisation or similar processes will retain their hedonic value, mouthfeel, etc.?
Empirically, it has to be. I mean, that's the whole point of R&D, and doing things like, for example, electronic tongue and sensory panels and these sorts of things. I guess it's a hugely active area. So, for example, in the whole 3D printing, food printing area, 4D printing, the technology is rapidly advancing, and so there's a sort of a body of knowledge which I guess can direct us in the way that we can do all these things that we need to do. Like, for example, produce products that people will eat. That's one rather important feature, or pets will eat, if not human. And then, of course, the nutritional aspect. But as like everything, there's a lot of novel products coming onto the market all the time, and so there's always this necessity to do sort of, I guess, the hard work in terms of just proving its value. So, for example, I was talking to a lady just recently. She has the largest organic lavender farm in the country, in Tasmania, in the Huon Valley. And what she wants to do is value-added a product by making it a food. So this is lavender, like flowers. So she wants to actually create a beverage product, which is kefir, or a kefir-like product. So that itself is a challenge, in terms of making it something people want. There's different levels, So I think in the end, there's a lot of practical aspects that have to be considered as well. Like, when we talk about very nutritious fish, you might end up with feedstocks that might end up in totally different products. Like, the food product may not necessarily be what you start with. It might have no semblance that it's using material feedstocks to create novel products. This is the whole area of innovation in food. But of course, a lot of people want food that's the natural raw state as well. But of course, that's going to cost money. That's going to be a premium product, probably more likely. So I'm not the best person to answer this question. Roger Stanley would have been better because it's more his area in this sort of innovative processing space. But that's how it's hopefully provide some insight.
Right. Thank you, John. Unless any of the panel members want to desperately answer that question, I'm kind of keen to move to the next one, as we've got quite a list now. So David Carter asked the question to Anna. You mentioned some of the limitations of MPAs as providers of extra fisheries productivity. I would be curious to know how you feel about the need to rethink the utility of the spatially rigid MPAs in a world where fish populations are on the move.
Yeah, well, look, I'm not an expert in MPAs or the decision-making process that goes into placing them where they're placed, but I'd imagine in a future where we need to have climate-sensitive fisheries management and flexible management, that MPAs that were shiftable would make sense in some contexts. I realised I forgot to do my summary slide, which is a bit annoying, but in that I talked a bit about the competition for food producing space in oceans from things like blue economy and the different sectors that are going to compete with that. And at the moment, we don't monitor that at all. We don't understand what the impacts are of putting ports or conservation or tourism in food producing areas. So having a better matrix to understand what the trade-offs and impacts are and flexibility across the system will be really important.
Thank you. I don't know if any of our other panelists want to enter into this discussion.
I'd only say I'd back up the need for flexibility into the future as the environment shifts. Static MPAs are unlikely to deliver on their initial intentions, at least. So yeah, it makes sense.
Right, thank you. All right, well, we'll keep going. So Duncan has asked the question, how much do cultural perceptions about seafood affect the opinion, what the opinions are? People from non-European backgrounds eat a wide variety of seafoods, which are often discarded here. So that's very open to any member of the panel who'd like to take it on.
I'm happy to talk to that one. I suppose there's an opportunity there for us to look at how we better utilise every single piece of the fish or the animal, the squid, looking at, making the best and most efficient use of that resource that we've invested energy, money and nutrition in growing. So it's an opportunity, hopefully.
Right, thank you. Kind of sort of linked is another question from Damien. I presume some of the most nutritious fishes are not the tastiest. Will this mean post-harvest processing, i.e. manufactured fish products, will be more demanding? So that's an interesting one. I don't know if John wants to jump in there or Julie again.
I think when it comes to fish, I mean, it really depends on what your goals are. and what type of product you're interested in. I mean, as I showed you the data for Tasmania, salmon value addition is only 15 or 20%. So, I mean, most people want like a fresh product. So it's not like you can do a lot with it necessarily. You can make it safe and ensure it's, shelf, it's quality, and you can have evidence for that, basically, like chemical profiles, there's no antibiotic and other types of adulterants that might be present. But when it comes to more the innovative space, for example, canning products, you can still retain a lot of the quality and nutrition through sterilization sterilization processes. It's not like it's advanced since the 19th century where they started canning for the first time, Napoleon era. Stop people getting sick with botulism. But now we can do it in a sophisticated way that we can retain things like flavor, quality. So there's a lot more choice, I think, and a lot more sophistication that is possible. And I think we can also guarantee safety as well. But this all adds up to the cost of producing product if you're scaling up. And of course, this means what point of the market you're going to be at, premium or middle range, that sort of thing. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm kind of going to move to people who with names who've asked, unless somebody else wanted to contribute to that. Questions from people who've named themselves. So Alex has said, will a rise in global temperatures see cooler countries attempting to farm warm water species with lower requirements for non-sustainable ingredients? Well, there's a lot to unpack in that question, Alex, and it's a shame that Richard's presentation wasn't accessible to us. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Is there a way to make that accessible after the
No, Rich didn't want us to, so.
All right, okay.
Yeah, good question, Alex. I know you and I know each other. We're both nutritionalists, so maybe we'll talk about that one some more. And then maybe the last question from Matthew then, just to end on a contentious point. So thank you, everyone. Food security is improved when appropriate species are targeted or grown. What role should industry play in preserving the environment they want to exploit by developing species that are less damaging, though less popular as traditional seafood? So that does express, one of the challenges for the future. So whoever would like to.
Oh, I could have a comment.
Yes, thank you.
I think, it really takes a combined approach between targeting or growing those most nutritious fish and then making them available to a broad range of people physically and affordability wise, but also educating people in the value of consuming those fish and also making, changing our culture away from white fillets, towards these more stronger tasting fish, and it can happen. You can see cultures changing their preference for food. Chickens becoming huge in the Pacific, for example, but it'll take time, and I think a combined effort across multiple sectors.
Anybody else like to offer something for that last question?
Just that where you can use the kinds of tools that I talked about today, so where you take that whole systems approach, you can start to bring in social, cultural, as well as ecological and physical things and try to anticipate where combined effects of lots of things, whether it's climate change, other developments on land as well as in the ocean, can interact to have an outcome that might not be desirable if you knew about it ahead of time, so that you can plan appropriately. So there's more and more of those kind of tools becoming available as computing power and data become live. So I think that's one way where the different industries can also contribute, is by pooling data from whatever industry you're in to help that general lifting of knowledge so that we don't trip over unintended consequences into the future.
Thank you, Beth. Okay, well, if none of the other panelists wish to add to that question, I think now is a good time to wrap up this webinar. It's been a hugely fascinating, entertaining and stimulating collection of diverse, integrated talks covering many different aspects of food and food systems. It's been really wonderful to hear all of those talks and see the different parts of a jigsaw. And of course, in recognizing that, I would like to thank all of our speakers for the time and thought that they put into those presentations. One of my little phrases from Winston Churchill, I think, was, sorry, it was a long letter, I didn't have time to write a short one. Well, all of our presenters took the time to present a short presentation, which really hit the mark. And whilst, they clearly set up some immense challenges for us, I think it was also encouraging to see that there are solutions. There's a lot of deep thinking going on and a lot of people spending a lot of effort in trying to solve these problems, of course. So it leaves us on a sort of optimistic note. And again, it's something that the Blue Economy CRC is definitely wanting to contribute and participate in. So thank you again to all of our speakers, and thank you to everybody who attended and the questioners. And great, thank you until our next webinar.